On June 4th, 1943, Railroad Street, in Mexia, Texas, the pencil shook a little as Unificia Vera Burkhart wrote in his secret diary. He was recording thoughts that could lead to solitary confinement if found by his officers. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could have such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. As he looked out the train window, he saw something that contradicted 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Farmhouses, street corners, and shop windows all glowed with electric lights. An endless expanse of electricity illuminated the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. Back in Germany, blackout rules had thrown the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, only about 20% of farms in rural Germany had electricity. Yet, here, in what Nazi propaganda had called a decadent and collapsing America, electricity flowed freely. 1850 veterans of Irwin RML's Africa Corps stepped off the passenger train. They did not arrive in cattle cars or freight wagons, but in comfortable Pullman coaches with dining services and sleeping berths. The entire population of Mexia gathered to see them. What none of them realized was that this moment would spark a profound psychological change in modern history. It would systematically demolish Nazi ideology, showcasing American industrial power. The calculations for Allied victory were being written not in battle strategies, but in production numbers. These figures would soon challenge every belief these soldiers held about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The collapse had begun on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rammel's replacement, surrendered with around 255,000 German and Italian soldiers. The numbers changed as scattered units continued to surrender over several days. The Wehrmacht's most seasoned desert fighters, who had pushed the British back to Egypt and earned respect from Montgomery, found themselves as prisoners. Among them was Hetman Friedrich Radke, a holder of the Iron Cross First Class and a veteran of the campaign in France, who had been wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, found decades later in the National Archives, would give historians the most detailed insight into the psychological effects of American captivity on German soldiers. The journey from defeat to revelation started at the port of Oran, Algeria. As Radke and 30,000 other prisoners of war waited in makeshift camps for transport ships, American efficiency began to shatter their expectations. The United States Army processed thousands of prisoners every day with an organizational precision that surpassed anything the German army had achieved at its peak. They photographed and filed identity cards. Medical examinations were completed, inoculations were given, and American officers fluent in German explained Geneva Convention rights. But the first major shock came with the food. Operator Hans Muir, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later. While waiting for ships at Oran, the Americans fed them better than they had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. They were served white bread, real coffee, and meat twice a day. Initially, they thought it was propaganda meant to impress them. They did not realize this was the standard military ration. The Liberty ships that would transport them across the Atlantic were themselves testaments to American industrial capacity. The SS Robert E. Peary was constructed in just 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes at Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. This would have been dismissed as impossible propaganda by the Germans if they had known. At the peak of production, 3 of these vessels were created each day, returning from delivering supplies to the European theater. Instead of sailing back empty, they transported human cargo, carrying up to 30,000 prisoners of war each month by the summer of 1943. A 2-week journey across the Atlantic in July 1943 marked the second phase of their psychological unraveling. Feldkurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a thorough account in letters to his family after his return. He noted that the ship's crew disposed of more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. The American sailors discarded half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, and gallons of milk that had been left out too long, Zimmermann wrote. They did this openly, without any thought. They were not trying to mock them. To the Americans, this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became floating examples of American power. The prisoners learned that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war. Each one required 250,000 parts assembled from components manufactured in 32 states. The engines, they learned from the talkative American guards, were manufactured in 3 different factories. Each factory produced 900 horsepower cylinders, which were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steuben, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, as our ship approached the American coast, "I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we, and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. At that moment, I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war. On August 2, 1943, at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the first sight of America shattered any remaining Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres. Its dock stretched for miles, with cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships at the same time. In just one day, this single port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg could manage in a week." Gerrit Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted in his secret diary, lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They moved smoothly and continuously, powered by electricity and free of the coal smoke that choked our industrial cities. The prisoners were formed into columns for the march to the waiting trains. Along the way, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, many belonging to dock workers. In Germany, private automobile ownership was still a privilege for the wealthy and the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, remained just a propaganda dream, with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary workers drove to their jobs in their own cars, but nothing prepared them for the trains themselves. They did not board boxcars or the 48 wagons used to transport German troops across Europe. Instead, they entered full passenger coaches. There were Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths. Dining cars featured white tablecloths and silver cutlery. Observation Cheesy Koldar had panoramic windows. Hetman Radke wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners. The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized for the air conditioning not working well in our car." Air conditioning. In August, we thought that kind of luxury was something found only on Hitler's personal train. The 3-day journey by train from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma would challenge Nazi ideology more than any military defeat could. As the trains traveled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, seeing an America that contradicted everything they had been told. Every small town was brightly lit. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro towns that in Germany would be lucky to have a single electric street lamp showed, illuminated shop windows, bright electric signs, and houses lit up in multiple rooms. The trains rolled by factories operating night shifts, their windows aglow, their parking lots full, even at midnight. Obergreiter Mayer, whose father held a leadership position in the Nazi Party in Hamburg, wrote in a letter found in 1987, "We passed through countless cities that night. They had more electricity than all of Hamburg combined. The guards told us this was common, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He shrugged and insisted we would see the truth for ourselves." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners observed American railway workers accomplishing in 30 minutes what would take 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, and mechanized lubrication systems. Every part of the operation showcased remarkable technological superiority. Even more unsettling was the easy wealth of the workers. They wore leather boots that would cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and discarded the empties without a second thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, putting them out halfway through. Failed engineer Hinrich Müller, who worked in Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard where we stopped used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. The waste was impressive, he wrote. They left lights on in empty buildings. It showed a disregard for infinite resources. As the trains moved into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners witnessed American industrial power in full force. Through the windows, they saw endless factories, each one The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee was larger than anything most had encountered in Germany. It extended for 3 miles along the river. Its electric furnaces demanded 175,000 kilowatts of power, exceeding the entire consumption of the city of Munich. As trains approached Louisville, they slowed down to pass the Rubbertown complex. In just 18 months, synthetic rubber plants emerged from the empty fields. 4 enormous facilities employed thousands and produced 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber each year. In stark contrast, Germany had only managed to make 120,000 tons in its best year, despite inventing the process. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, quickly grasped what this meant. He later remembered in a post-war interview, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns and the catalytic crackers. Every facility was more advanced than anything we had constructed, and there were 4 of them at this one location. They told us there were many more across the country." The trains also passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, noticeable from miles away. This single factory, completed in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts made by 1,000 subcontractors. The factory occupied 2.5 million square feet and consumed more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hutman Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot captured over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they travelled by. He spotted 17 B-24s in different stages of assembly visible from the train. We had been told that American planes were inferior, hastily constructed, and would fall apart in combat. But I could see the precision of the assembly lines and the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could ever imagine. As the trains journeyed deeper into America, Nazi mythology continued to crumble. Insane mythology continued to crumble. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River via the Eads Bridge. Below, barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. The prisoners noticed grain elevators lining both banks, each capable of holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Carl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food, just as we transport ammunition, in endless quantities and without worry for loss. I saw them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was munching on a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train came to a stop at a huge stockyard filled with tens of thousands of cattle waiting for slaughter. The smell from the meatpacking plants lingered in the air for miles. German prisoners of war who had been surviving on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa when the 50th, I were lucky, watched American workers enjoying beef sandwiches during their lunch breaks. "They feasted on meat like we wished we could feast on bread," wrote grieving Paul Fisher. No, that's not right. They ate meat like we longed to eat bread. A guard treated us to hamburgers from a nearby stand. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without a second thought and paid with a single dollar bill. This was not a special occasion. This was just their everyday food. Arriving at the camps brought a new level of shock. Camp Hearn in Texas, constructed in just 4 months, held between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners. The conditions there surpassed what many had experienced as civilians. Wooden barracks featured electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building had more lumber than entire German villages could gather. The camp hospital astonished the medical staff among the prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most hospitals in Germany. There were X-ray machines, surgical tools, and pharmaceutical supplies that had not been available in Germany since 1941. This was standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Tomexillin. Bauer would later testify, this miraculous drug we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying from the lack of basic sulfur drugs, while the Americans provided us with their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen became yet another lesson in American abundance. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties found walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of preparing meals for 5, though, US and men. The daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, all in amounts that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwall Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, noted, "Today, we discarded more food than my family has seen in 3 years. It was not spoiled food. It was simply surplus. American regulations require that we prepare 10% more than necessary to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The extra food is simply thrown away." I felt a deep sadness as I discarded perfectly good bread into the trash. By September 1943, a labor shortage in American agriculture led to the employment of prisoners of war in fields and factories across the country. This decision, made out of necessity, undermined Nazi ideology more effectively than any propaganda ever could. Every day, groups of prisoners were transported to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without any blindfolds or restricted routes. They witnessed everything: the endless fields of corn and wheat, factories running around the clock, shops overflowing with goods, parking lots filled with cars, and homes equipped with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, and homes complete with refrigerators. Unratsir Herbert Lang observed a single machine processing more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have managed in a month, using traditional methods. The gin operated on electricity supplied by the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that provided power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nothing extraordinary, Lang noted. He was neither aristocratic nor a party member, just a regular farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including African Americans, had lunches packed with more food than German workers received in an entire week. This was the norm. Every farm we saw was similar. In Nebraska, prisoners toiled in sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural machinery that seemed unbelievable. They learned that a single combine harvester could accomplish the work of 100 men. The fields stretched endlessly, each larger than entire German counties. The farmers casually spoke of crop yields that would have seemed like a fantasy in Germany. They talked about producing 60 bushels of wheat per acre, compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, who worked on a farm near Scottsbluff, wrote about a farmer's son who, at only 16 years old, drove a tractor valued at more than everything his father had earned over a lifetime. When he shared this, the boy laughed and said it was not even a particularly good tractor. His father was eagerly awaiting a new model from John Deere that would be even better. The most shocking revelations came to prisoners who worked near or inside American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct warfare, production work allowed prisoners of war to assist in industries that freed American workers to focus on military production. This situation enabled many German prisoners to see American industrial capabilities up close. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, they observed production lines processing more tomatoes in 1 day than most German factories managed in a month. The factory ran with a minimal crew of women and elderly men, as most young workers were serving in the military. Still, their production surpassed peacetime levels. Stabsfeld Webel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, recorded his experiences. Everything was automated. Electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, and steam cookers processed hundreds of Kala MS at once. One elderly woman managed controls that would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while enjoying coffee and listening to the radio. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant caught glimpses of the automotive industry's shift to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. This plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Oberreiter France, Kellner wrote about the parking lots filled with cars belonging to workers. These were workers in Germany. Even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory workers drove to their jobs. The guard informed us that many workers had 2 cars, one for work and one for family use. We thought he was mocking us. By winter of 1943, the cumulative effect of these observations led to what American intelligence officers described as ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners, the Special Projects Division, DARMD. A secret re-education program run by the Pro-Marshal General's Office noted an increasing number of prisoners wanting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland, a monitoring team member, reported in December 1943 that the prisoners no longer argued when presented with production statistics. They had seen too much. The most dedicated Nazis became quiet. They still felt loyal to Germany, but they no longer spoke of victory. Many began to openly question what they had been told about America. The camp newspapers, written by the prisoners themselves, began to reflect this change. Dear Ruth, the publication at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually transformed from a stance of defiant nationalism to discussions about democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, who were carefully chosen anti-Nazi prisoners, found that their audience was becoming more receptive. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors. We were told that America was a mixed nation, weak and divided, controlled by Jews, and incapable of military strength. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were fed fairy tales by criminals. The most severe blow to Nazi ideology came from an unexpected source: the treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Italian prisoners of war who chose to cooperate were formed into service units. They enjoyed better living conditions, higher pay, and more freedom. German prisoners observed their former allies working with Americans, dining in American restaurants, and even dating American women. Heckmann Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, and send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to loathe seems more honorable than our own system." Christmas of 1943 had an especially profound psychological impact. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent out 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners of war, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just months before. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, although regulations kept most from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn contributed homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the remaining pieces of Nazi racial theory. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, who had lost his brother in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies. Yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely confident of victory and secure in their power." The Christmas feast itself was beyond comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. These were quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. The prisoners feasted until they felt sick, struggling to comprehend such resources being offered to enemies. "We ate like royalty," wrote Feldwebel-Hunzer. Better than the generals of Germany eat, better than the leaders of the party. And this was not a special occasion. The guards informed us that this was a typical American Christmas dinner, that every American family was enjoying the same meal. If they can feed prisoners in this way, what must their own soldiers be eating? By early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and various sciences. The University of Chicago offered correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to give lectures on democracy and economics. The hunger for knowledge was immense. Prisoners who had been told that Americans were cultured barbarians discovered libraries filled with millions of books, universities that accepted all social classes, and scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, exploring multiple viewpoints, which was impossible in Nazi Germany. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge even with enemies. This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology. The camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a portrayal of American defeat and recovery that echoed their own experiences. They watched The Grapes of Wrath, astonished that Americans would openly display such self-criticism to their enemies. They hide nothing, wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. They reveal their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would lead to death. Here, it is seen as patriotic. In spring 1944, expanded prisoner labor programs emerged as American production peaked. German prisoners of war worked in canneries, mills, and manufacturing plants, witnessing the full force of American industrial power. The numbers told a compelling story. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day. They observed workers assembling 700 boats each month, with each boat requiring 20,000 parts. The factory had 20,000 employees, including many women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines. Stabsfeld Wiebel Kurt Zimmermann noted, "Women doing men's work, African Americans operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment, everything we were told was impossible in a democracy." Yet production never ceased. They worked 3 shifts, 20 pounds, 4 hours a day, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in 1 month than our entire Navy built in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners saw the factory producing 10,000 tons of steel every day. The blast furnaces ran non-stop, fueled by endless trains bringing iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale was beyond German understanding. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr region at its peak. Oberreiter Paul Hartmann recalled, "I worked at Krupp before the war. I thought I understood industrial production, but this was beyond belief. They wasted more steelage than we could produce." He added that workers complained about overtime, while creating amounts we couldn't achieve with slave labor and double confront shifts. The summer of 1944 marked the final collapse of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners worked throughout the Midwest, observing agricultural production capable of feeding the world. In Kansas, they saw wheat harvests from single farms yielding more grain than whole German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships sailing on an ocean of gold, each harvesting 100 acres daily. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Unteroffizier Franz Berber, a farmer from East Prussia, noted that one American farmer with machinery could do the work of 100 German farmers. They showed him aerial photographs of wheat fields stretching thousands of square miles. They realized they could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that seemed to stretch endlessly. They watched as perfectly good fruit was thrown away for minor imperfections, fruit that would have been cherished back in Germany. Sometimes entire crops were simply discarded. Food was destroyed to maintain prices, which caused psychological distress among prisoners from hunger-stricken Germany. They buried mountains of oranges because there was an oversupply. We begged to send them home to our families. The guards were sympathetic, but they explained it was impossible. This waste illustrated the abundance of resources available. On June 6, 1944, when news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, German prisoners faced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the invasion, the camps of the bigness. With 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the first wave, showcased America's organizational strength beyond what Nazi Germany could imagine. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, and a supply system delivering 15,000 tons of material daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being devastated by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. Our Friedrich Vonterben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with tales and racial myths. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources. Throughout their captivity, German prisoners encountered something that challenged Nazi ideology more than material wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda portraying Americans as weak and sentimental, the prisoners found a people confident enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gerrit Hans Miller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered his condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany, even while the country was actively bombing. They made a clear distinction, separating the German people from the Nazi regime. As Hetman Otto noted, they claimed they were fighting against Hitler, not the Germans. This distinction, which initially seemed like propaganda, turned out to be sincere. They were preparing us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. The medical treatment also made a significant impact on the prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques and using advanced equipment. Prisoners received medical care that would have been reserved for the elite in Germany. Treatment for mental health issues, which was nearly non-existent in the German military, was provided to soldiers suffering from trauma. Dr. Tutig rated Japan to cavius a day. Friedrich Bauer noted, they treated those who attempted suicide with counseling rather than punishment. Soldiers with mental breakdowns received therapy instead of beatings. This compassion shown to enemies displayed a strength we had never understood, the confidence of true power. By March 1945, a secret re-education program had achieved impressive results. More than 25,000 prisoners volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers published articles on constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. The program's success took everyone by surprise. Prisoners who had entered the camps as fanatical Nazis began writing essays on democratic reconstruction. Officers who had pledged loyalty to Hitler started planning how to introduce American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. We became missionaries for democracy, admitted Ust Hermann Göring, who was not related to the Reich Marshal, indifferent, a 1975 interview. It was not through coercion or propaganda. It came through observation. We witnessed its effectiveness. We saw ordinary people living better than the German aristocracy. We desired that for Germany. The change was so significant that American authorities grew concerned about prisoners becoming overly enthusiastic about American ideals. Some expressed a desire to remain in America after the war. Others married American women they met through correspondence programs while in prison. Thousands eventually moved to America in the 1950s. In April 1945, the final revelation occurred. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German prisoners. Many initially refused to believe it, claiming it was propaganda. However, the evidence was undeniable. Testimonies from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters from Germany confirmed the horrors. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had retained some pride in German honor, despite military defeat, now confronted the complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they fought for was not only defeated, but deemed evil. Hetman Walter Schmidt penned a powerful summary. We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we often labeled as weak and decadent showed us the true meaning of civilization. When the war ended in May 1945, German prisoners of war faced a mix of feelings about going home. They had seen an America that shattered their preconceived notions. As prisoners, they had better meals than they did as soldiers. They experienced more respect from their enemies than from their own government. The final months of TD 1765-2 and to vote, air captivity was spent gearing up for a return to a devastated Germany. American authorities offered vocational training, agricultural education, and lessons in politics. The prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was even official, realizing that America aimed to rebuild rather than punish Germany. They prepared us to reconstruct our country, wrote Ost Friedrich von Turbin. They gave us skills, knowledge, and hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into prospective citizens. This kindness from victors was unimaginable for those molded by Nazi retribution. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners of war were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany that was divided, destroyed, and impoverished. Yet they carried with them something invaluable. They understood the workings of a democratic industrial society. The German prisoners of war who experienced American prosperity became unwitting catalysts for change in post-war Germany. They had witnessed industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic success. They knew that Reconstruction was attainable because they had seen a society that accomplished it. Many former prisoners achieved prominence in the rebuilding of West Germany. Hans Kroll, a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught at Camp Koh, became the president of the European Commission. Rudiger von Marr, held at Camp Herne, served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackermann, a prisoner at Fort Robinson, emerged as a leader in German agricultural reform. They introduced American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic principles to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1990s and 50s was partly founded on the knowledge acquired in American prison camps. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll reflected in his memoirs. We observed that democracy fosters wealth, that diversity enhances strength, and that treating workers well boosts productivity. These lessons learned during captivity significantly shaped the new Germany. Historians have described the experience of German prisoners of war in America as one of the most effective re-education programs ever. Without force or traditional propaganda, the strength of American industry and democracy transformed steadfast Nazis into future democratic citizens. This success came from observation rather than words. Prisoners witnessed American society operating at its best while treating former enemies with respect. They realized the industrial capabilities of the United States made German production seem outdated. They also experienced a quality of life that revealed the false promises of the Nazi regime. Dr. Sir-President Hebrajim, Arnold Kramer, a leading historian on German prisoners of war in the United States, stated, "America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prosperity they encountered changed them. The numbers back this up. Out of 371,683 German prisoners of war in America, fewer than 1% tried to escape, with only 2,222 attempts recorded. After the war, surveys indicated that 95% of them rated their treatment as good or excellent. Remarkably, many kept in touch with American families for decades. In 1985, to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the war's conclusion, surviving German prisoners of war gathered in Austin, Sursapoldi, gave W. Head, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation began. Former Oberritter Hans Weyer, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later became a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke during the reunion. He said life in the camps was a significant improvement for those of us who came from cold water flats in Germany. We found running water, central heating, and plenty of food. More importantly, we found dignity. Former Stabsfeld-Weibel Kurt Meir, who worked on farms in Iowa, shared, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, and sometimes their homes. This humanity came from people whose sons were fighting against us. This changed us forever." At the 1985 reunion dinner, former Obersturmbannführer Hermann Gutz, at 78 years old, delivered a keynote address that encapsulated the essence of their transformation. He said, "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. Strength comes from production, not from conquest. It arises from diversity, not from hatred. It is rooted in freedom, not in tyranny. We witnessed America's arsenal of democracy in action. We saw farmers who provided food for the world, workers who constructed the tools for victory, and citizens who treated their enemies with dignity. We understood that America's greatest strength was not its bombs or tanks, but its endless ability to create and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a commitment to build a society capable of creation rather than destruction, one that could thrive through peace instead of war. The Germany that emerged from the ruins was shaped by the lessons learned in American prison camps. We arrived as conquerors, but libard between dame why, feet as students. Now, from your former enemies, we are your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans stood together, former enemies united in acknowledgement of a transformation that seemed impossible when the first trains arrived in Texas in June 1943. The impact of the German prisoner experience in America can be seen in stark statistics. There were over 500 camps spread across 45 states, with the exception of Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. This included 175 main camps and 325 branch camps. These facilities were built to house between 250 and 12,000 prisoners each, with construction completed in an average of 90 days per camp. The prisoner population reached 371,683 German prisoners, part of a total of 425,871 Axis prisoners. The peak population occurred in May 1945. In 1943, there was an average of 20,000 new arrivals each month. After D-Day, this rose to 30,000 monthly, and in the final months of the war, it escalated to 60,000 per month. The labor contribution was significant, totaling 14 million man-days of agricultural work. They processed 100 million board feet of lumber, which valued at $230 million in the labor market of the 1940s, with prisoners earning an average daily wage of 80 cents. These prisoners filled critical labor shortages across 46 states. When it came to escape attempts, there were only 2,271,000 prisoners, which is just 0.6%. There were no successful permanent escapees, and most escapees were recaptured within 24 hours. No American civilians were harmed by escaped prisoners. In terms of educational programs, more than 40,000 prisoners enrolled in various courses. They published 135 camp newspapers. About 30,000 were taking English classes, while 15,000 received vocational training, and 8,000 participated in university correspondence courses. After the war, around 5,000 former prisoners of war immigrated to the United States. More than 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families. The average time of correspondence lasted 31 years. Many individuals returned as tourists or business partners. When evaluating their treatment, 95% rated it as good or excellent. 74% felt that their captivity had positively altered their worldview. 61% showed an interest in learning about democracy. By 1945, fewer than 10% still held strong Nazi beliefs. The German prisoners of war experienced American industrial power firsthand. They didn't just witness history, they were fundamentally changed by it. Their captivity turned into an educational experience. Their defeat led to enlightenment. Their imprisonment became liberation from the ideological shackles of Nazism. Ultimately, America's most significant victory was not achieved on the battlefield, but in the prison camps. There, the undeniable evidence of democratic prosperity accomplished what armies could not: the complete transformation of enemy minds. These individuals arrived with a belief in German superiority and perceived American weakness. They departed having learned the truth. The might of American industry was not only overwhelming, it was unimaginable to those molded by scarcity and oppression. The trains that brought T. Vinard, weather systems, summer and normal Diard, hem into captivity in 1943 carried soldiers of the Third Reich. The ships that took them back to Germany in 1946 carried future builders of democracy. They witnessed the future, and it functioned. Their experiences bear witness to a profound truth. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not its military strength, but the compelling evidence of the ability of a free society to create abundance. The German prisoners of war were astonished by American industrial might, yet ultimately, they were transformed by it. In their conversion lay the seeds of Europe's post-war recovery and the final defeat of the Nazi ideology. They returned to Germany not as defeated foes, but as witnesses to the achievements of free societies. The economic miracle that reshaped West Germany in the 1950s was built on the foundations laid in American prison camps. There, enemy soldiers learned that prosperity arises not from conquest but from freedom. It does not flow from racial superiority, but from human dignity. It is not sustained by totalitarian control, but through democratic cooperation. The German prisoners of war came to America expecting to find a weak and divided nation on the brink of collapse. Instead, they encountered an industrial giant brimming with unlimited potential and surprising compassion. They arrived as captives, but departed as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its zenith. The astonishment at the abundance in America planted the psychological roots of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic rebuilding of Germany. They had witnessed America, and their perspectives would forever be altered. Their children would grow up in a democratic Germany allied with the United States. This partnership began when veterans of the 1850 Africa Corps disembarked from a train in Mexia, Texas. They soon realized that everything they had believed was incorrect. The narrative of German prisoners of war in America ultimately tells a tale of redemption through revelation. It shows that sometimes the most significant victories come not from destruction but from demonstration. They are achieved not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not through hatred but through humanity. The German soldiers who experienced American industrial strength became unexpected ambassadors of democracy. They returned to their homeland carrying the seeds of change that would blossom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Their transformation from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens stands as one of the most remarkable shifts in modern history. This change occurred not through force, but through the undeniable proof of what free people could accomplish together. Ultimately, that was America's secret weapon. It was not just the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any other nation. It was the power to turn enemies into friends through the simple strength of example. The German prisoners of war were amazed by America's industrial capabilities, but more importantly, they were transformed by them. In that transformation lay the groundwork for a better world.